in conjunction with our current exhibition at ISLAA, Threads to the South, which was curated by Anna Burckhardt Pérez. The event today will feature 2 presentations by Bryan-Wilson and Lynne Cooke, followed by a moderated discussion led by Anna Burckhardt Pérez. And just as a note, wanted to also mention that unfortunately one of the speakers who was previously announced, Shade Arimunde, is no longer available to participate due to a family emergency. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art, or ISLAA, is a research institute dedicated to advancing the study and visibility of art from Latin America through our exhibitions, publications, research initiatives, and partnerships with universities and art institutions. So just a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. The bathrooms are to the back of this gallery through that sliding door. We are asking everyone to refrain from using the elevators throughout the program to minimize noise. And after the event concludes, we'll also be holding a reception for the back of the space in our back room. You're all welcome to stick around, spend time in the exhibition, and enjoy the show in its final weeks. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Anna Burckhardt Pérez is a curator and writer from Bogota interested in the intersections of contemporary art, craft, technology, community-based practices, and ecologies in Latin America. She is currently the Neville Bryan Assistant Curator of Architecture and Design at the Art Institute of Chicago. And prior to joining the Art Institute, she worked at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Lastly, I'd like to thank Anna, Julia, and Lynne for sharing their work with us today, and my colleagues for their support and collaboration on this event. ISLAA's founder, Ariel Isaacs, our executive director, Lucy Hunter, our chief curator, Bernardo Mosquera, our editorial assistant, Nolan Kelly, our AV technician, Josh Laskin, and our videographer, Trevor King. So it'll be a great pleasure to turn it over to Anna, who will introduce the event and the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Can everybody hear me okay? And thank you all for joining us. Thanks also for bearing with us as we settled some technical difficulties. I am very happy to be here to listen to and in conversation with Julia Bryan-Wilson and Lynne Cooke in conjunction with this exhibition called Threads to the South. Before we start, I'm going to give you a really brief introduction to the exhibition, but we do hope that, if you have the time, please join us afterwards and take a look at the show. Threads to the South is the second iteration of a set of exhibitions at this new space at ISLAA. And the exhibition focuses on the work of artists that are working with fiber to investigate the relationship between identity, belonging, and territory in Latin America. When ISLAA invited me to curate a show that focused on their really great holdings of textile art, or art that engages in textile, I was really excited to do a project that would sort of localize the discourse around fiber within Latin America. And when I say that, I mean the particular traditions and identities that exist within Latin America. And as I was sort of looking through ISLAA's really wonderful holdings, which are very diverse, as you can kind of see as you walk through the show, I noticed that a lot of the artists were looking at textile, and particularly textile traditions, as a way to reconnect with what they perceived to be a lost root that had been lost for various reasons, overall histories of colonization in the region, but also very personal histories of displacement and violence. And in doing so, I thought fiber and textiles in particular would be a really wonderful way to explore ideas of kind of a fractured identity, particularly in a region that still grapples with the legacies of colonialism. Textiles, as we know, and I'm sure we will discuss later, are very personal. We live with them every single day. And therefore, they're very apt to explore ideas of identity and belonging. But at the same time, I was really interested in, and I think this is something that we can also discuss today, in the sort of contradictory nature of textiles, or the way in which they can hold many different meanings at the same time. And this was really interesting to me in the context of a region like Latin America that is sort of still grappling with what it means to come from the South and the histories of colonization. And so, You'll notice that a lot of the works here are very varied in their textile practices, but most of them are kind of rooted in very particular traditions that have been passed down through generations. And yes, as I mentioned before, I really welcome you to stay later afterwards and look at the show. And of course, if you have questions, we can talk about them later. But we are very excited we were very excited to invite Julia and Lynne to this event because, as we will talk about later, there has been a sort of growing interest in textiles, particularly institutionally in the past few years. And so this event in particular was sort of geared towards highlighting some of the most exciting and important projects around textile. And so really, without much further ado, I will introduce our panelists in order of speaking. Julia Bryan-Wilson is Professor of Contemporary Art History and LGBTQ+ Studies at Columbia University. She is the author of the influential book Fray, Art and Textile Politics from 2017, which was the first to receive 3 of the major laurels in art history, the ASAP Book Prize, the Frank Jewett Mather Award, and the Robert Motherwell Book Award. She organized with Andrea Anderson the first traveling retrospective of Cecilia Vicuña, as well as curating a monographic exhibition featuring textile artist Liz Collins. As curator at large at the Museum of Art of Sao Paulo, MASPI, Bryan-Wilson has been at the forefront of integrating textiles into exhibitions that include women's history, art before 1900. And then, of course, Lynne Cooke is senior curator of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Arts at the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. From 2012 to 2014, she was Andrew W. Mellon Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, National Gallery of Art. Prior to that, she served as chief curator and deputy director of the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid from 2008 to 2012, and as curator at Dia Art Foundation from 1991 to 2008. In 1991, Cooke co-curated the Carnegie International and has since helmed numerous major shows, including the 10th Biennale of Sydney, Rosemary Truckle, Cosmos, and Outlier and American Vanguard of 2018. She has published widely, including texts on Agnes Martin, Frances Ali, Zoe Leonard, James Castle, and Bridget Riley. Thank you so much for joining us, and I leave it to you.
Well, thank you to Anna, and thank you to everyone at ISLAA. It's a real joy to be here. Thank you also for coming out on this hot day. I am going to begin. Hopefully, I don't know how to do this. Let's see. Hold on. Sorry for there, right? Yeah, it's very particular. It's like a video game that I'm losing. A video game I'm bad at. Oh, there we go. Yes. Okay, I'm actually going to start my timer so that I don't go over, because I want to leave plenty of time for both Lynne and our conversation. I organized my presentation around just 3 projects that I've engaged with about curating fiber-based art, and my kind of keyword was collaboration. And so I'm just going to very briefly sketch these 3 projects and talk about them through the lens of what it means not only to collaborate with artists, but also in a way to collaborate with the past, and in my opinion, most importantly, to kind of like collaborate with the material. And I think textiles and fiber in general really lend themselves to a sense of collaboration, because they are this kind of animate matter that holds a lot of memory, holds a lot of stories, and as Anna mentioned, are very, very intimate. And to me, if you listen to them and their tactility, there's just a lot that you can learn. So I collaborated with the wonderful scholar and curator Andrea Anderson to organize the first major traveling exhibition of Cecilia Vicuña, the Chilean poet and sculptor, who is now, of course, very well known. But when we were organizing this show, she was really at the margins of a lot of discourses around contemporary art. And she was very widely known in Latin America and in this city, especially as a poet. So this show, which originated at the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans, featured really extensive site visits by Cecilia and by myself, because Cecilia really wanted to emphasize her resonance with the space of New Orleans, because she has been deeply interested in the question of climate crisis since she was like basically a 14-year-old girl. And I'm just putting up here the cover of my book, Fray, that features a chapter that engages with Cecilia along with these more vernacular textiles called arpilleras, and that's a little sculpture by Cecilia on the cover. So Cecilia did a number of site-specific works for this show, including works that referenced the very sort of particularities of New Orleans as a space that is under incredible pressure, as a coastal city that is undergoing rapid erosion. So this quipu, and you see other examples of works inspired by the quipu here by Jorge Eilson in this lovely show. This quipu was inspired by the colors of an orchid that's found only in New Orleans, and also makes reference to viscera and kind of guts and intestines, and has this really bodily influence. This is a beautiful shot. I love to document installations. I think I'm always aware that I'm kind of generating my own archive of working with artists when they're putting things together. So this is, of course, Cecilia working on a scissor lift to install these long lengths of unspun wool roving that she sources sustainably. And just, I think that, she's such a hands-on maker that often the work is comes to fruition only in the gallery space, and that was true in this case. As I said, she did a lot of extensive site visits, and a big important part of that is she makes work out of literal trash, and she theorizes this as a brown woman coming from the global south, someone who has been thought of as something to be thrown away, someone who is always living under the threat of being understood as to be discarded. So here she is picking trash, actually all of it quite picturesque and beautiful, kind of garbage that was in the Mississippi River, finding things in this park, and these all became the raw materials for this massive installation, her balsa snake raft, which she envisioned as a kind of exploded vision of kind of society after the climate crisis that will take us all, and kind of what remains of that. And so she was hanging all this detritus in the space. And to me, one of the things that I have always really loved about her work with fiber is that she traverses many scales, from the really intimate little precarios that she makes that often are engage with threads and yarns, et cetera, or bits of scraps of fabric, and then the really large scale, the quipus and this snake raft that take on a kind of rangy, monumental quality. So the next project I want to discuss is a show that I co-curated with Mariana Lemme and Lilia Schwartz at MOSPI in Sao Paulo in 2019, and it was called Women's Histories, Art Before 1900. So it's important that you know that everything we were trying to grapple with in this show had to be made, prior to the 20th or 21st centuries. And there was a second part of the show, which was called Feminist Histories, that only dealt with artists more emerging artists. And I can't get into that here. We could talk about it in the Q&A. But when I came in, I was hired as a curator at large in late 2018, and this show was already underway, and it was going to be exclusively painting by women before 1900. And that's a great show. That's an important show. Those are important interventions to make. But I felt very strongly that women have been making cultural practices before 1900 that have not been categorized as art, and art as a very colonial framework, as a masculinist framework, and that if we didn't include those, that the show would be fine, it would tell an interesting story, but in my mind, it wouldn't be a feminist show, really, like a progressive feminist show. So I fought and I won the battle to have textiles included, and as a result, it became a really fascinating show that put textiles and painting side by side, and often actually in great tension, starting with pre-contact mantles, from Chimu culture, et cetera, that the museum owns, on long-term loan, and they had to be rotated for conservation purposes because they're quite delicate, exquisite textiles, all made by women in pre-contact Andean cultures that were the figure one. So when you walked into the gallery space, what you saw were Andean, female-made, examples of what we could, what I would call cultural practice, creative practices. The word art, to me is very flexible, sometimes very problematic when trying to discuss women's making, because women have been so historically excluded from this, the vaunted category of art. So what was exciting about this was that it was alongside paintings by people like Artemisia Gentileschi, who were, often had some access to these very fine cloths and textiles because of colonization. So it was just a very interesting conversation between sometimes what was represented in the paintings by these mostly upper class women, who had access to oil paint, et cetera, and sometimes such fabrics were even, detailed in their canvases, and then the actual textiles themselves. So just a couple more examples of some of the pairings that we did in this hang. A still life, and of course a still life is a very sort of considered a lowly genre in the hierarchy of genres, and often women gravitated to that. This is a woman from the Netherlands, painting in 1764, and that's next to a very exquisite floral silk embroidery. We don't know who made it, and I've put, the name formerly known, because someone knew who that was. It's not anonymous. It hasn't been recorded in history, from Great Britain around the same time. So kind of contemporaries, women working, but under very different conditions, with very different materials, and very different kind of classed resonances of what they were making. So this, to me, I thought of as a kind of collaboration, not only with my co-curators, but as a kind of collaboration between these genres, speaking to each other maybe from across a chasm, an unbridgeable chasm between sort of embroidery and oil paint. But what would happen if we kind of force those things together, and not to flatten the distinctions, because I think it's really important to recognize how these things have their different histories, but in a way to elucidate how there have been these exclusions around what has been considered proper to the category of art. So one last example from women's histories. This is the very last. I showed you the very first room. It moved roughly chronologically. This is the very last room, and the very final wall is these incredible 19th century quilts that, again, we don't know who sewed them. The women's names have been lost to history, but they are absolutely stunning and incorporate a lot of silk, and they were placed next to paintings Impressionist paintings by Mary Cassatt and Bert Morso. And to me, and the quilts were all from the Philadelphia area, and Mary Cassatt herself is from the Philadelphia area, so to me there was a really interesting conversation about kind of regional practices. And when you think about it, Impressionism and quilt making are both about the kind of opticality, a dazzling opticality of what can happen when you break up a picture plane with little bits of color. So Impressionism and quilts that actually on the surface have very little in common, in this polemic, have a kind of resonance between them in terms of how they actually work visually. So that was for me, that was an exciting opportunity to think further about curatorial approaches to textiles, integrating things across what has been called, across the kind of functional, non-functional divide. And then lastly, and I think I still have, I have 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Okay, so the last project I want to gloss is a solo show that I curated of the queer feminist textile artist Liz Collins, who herself works very fluidly between fashion, design, industry, fine art, etc. And this was a really exciting venue. It's called Touchstones Rochdale. Rochdale is a former mill town in Greater Manchester. So this is a place that had been fully made, a place, Greater Manchester, England, fully made by the textile trade. And of course, Marx and Engels lived in Manchester while they were thinking about, how to break the lockhold of industrialism, and Manchester as a kind of a site where textiles and how they break bodies and how dehumanization of the workforce happens is a very present story in Rochdale. So to fill it with textiles that in part have been a collaboration with industry, but in a totally different model of kind of artisanal making was a really interesting exercise. And Liz herself often wants to is really invested in the idea of kind of queering social space. And so what you're seeing here is two different installation shots. On the right, a kind of more museal, proper installation of her work, just some of her amazing, gorgeous, vibrant tapestries. one with two different orientations, you know, a rug on the floor, one hanging, etc. But then on the left was a space, she designed the wallpaper, she designed the rugs, she designed the fabric, and we reupholstered furniture. And this was actually turned over to queer residents of Rochdale and other former mill towns to use as a programming space. So they had the zine making workshop, they had poetry readings, they did all kinds of things within this space because we really felt to kind of end on the note of collaboration, that to make a show that's meant to be kind of responsive to the local context, it really doesn't make sense for me as a curator based in the US to come in and kind of tell people there, oh, what would you know, how can we make this relevant to you? Actually, let's turn it over to the people who really live there and understand what's happening. And they also helped curate this kind of show within a show, which was a really beautiful and amazing exercise for them to pull from the Touchstones collections. We also had other things from people like there's a Lubina Himid, Maud Salter, that's a Robert Indiana, but it's actually The Love, but it's was made into a textile. So it was a really amazing opportunity for local folks also to kind of take responsibility for, you know, making something that was meaningful to them in the context of a space that was really held by Liz's textiles. So I think that's all the time I have. Well, I have a minute, but I think I will just I'll just end there and hope to have more conversations. But I guess the thing that I'd want to just emphasize is that to me, fiber-based art, there's so many words that get used, you know, fiber-based. I'm sure you guys parsed that carefully. I truly do prefer the term textiles because I feel like it gets us away from this word art that to me, I guess I don't have that much investment in, you know? And a project like Liz's where those chairs are, I mean, yeah, they're art but they're also, you know, usable functional furniture, and she very much wants them to scramble those definitions. So I guess I'm not that invested in the word art when it comes to things that are like textile based. Thank you.
So the exhibition I'm going to talk about is called Woven Histories, Textiles and Modern Abstraction. I think we didn't quite land on the title. Maybe Woven Histories, Interlace Textiles and Modernist Abstraction might get a little closer. It's a show that has a number of threads. Metaphors like this will always come through. Therefore, I found it very difficult to actually kind of isolate the boundaries. But it's a show that was generated by work I've been seeing in the last 20 years that to me signals an efflorescence in the place of textile in contemporary art practice. And that has been so striking and compelling that I wanted to focus on here for this talk, on some of the artists whose work I saw, beginning around 2005, 6, and so on, who end up in the show and say something about what it was that drew my attention and try and give you some idea about how the show was constructed. So I'm an art historian trained, a curator today, in recent years, but my work really comes out of the present and things I've seen, and that in turn generates a looking back. So the past, of course, we can only ever see the past from the present, but the past informs the present in this project, and I think in others I've worked on. So I want also to say that in talking about an efflorescence in textile or an engagement with textile as a subject, it doesn't require, as it soon became evident to me, the use of fibrous materials, nor of textile technologies. Textile can be a subject in other ways by artists using other mediums. But in this instance, and this Diedrich Brackens is probably the youngest artist in the exhibition. He's in his 30s now. And he's African-American and has been making these wall hangings or weavings for a decade approximately. And the early ones he began to make at first were abstract. He had a wonderful show here a couple of months ago, which many of you may have seen, and his work is figurative, in part with a kind of ritualistic or ceremonial abstraction to it. But in these, in the beginning, his references were very much to kente cloth, wonderful African textiles, which were part of his diasporic heritage, and to other forms of textile making, and I would say particularly to quilts and G-span quilts in particular, which are really the acme of, for many people, of Black quilt making in this country. And drawing on both those traditions, he worked in the studio on a very small loom, and so the weavings, as you can see, are strips like the kente cloth, but the disposition and the rhythmic play of the color of the blocks of color, of course, refers to the quilts. And so these are ways of making a subject, drawing on a subject position through heritage and through past practices that are bound up with textile as a mnemonic, as a prompt to questions of identity with the body, as Julie was talking about, of corporeal relations and visual, textual relations. So, how do I get out of here? Oops, okay, great. So second artist I want to highlight is Ikshan Adams, whose work's also been seen in the city here quite a bit. And he grew up in South Africa in a colored township outside Cape Town, where his grandmother and other female family members really nurtured him in the absence of his parents. And he also studied at art school, but only after graduating began weaving in a studio with a vertical loom. And amongst the bodies of work he's made are some like this. They're wall hangings, they look absolutely sumptuous and gorgeous, and they have patterns, repeat abstract patterns that might immediately make you think about the great Islamic tradition of rug making from 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, some of the high points of textile making in any culture. And at the same time, when you look at the pattern, you can see these splodges on it. So what he's actually taking as a template, and these are 1-to-1 scale templates, are pieces of linoleum from the residences of neighbors when they're getting rid of the flooring and putting in new linoleum because it's worn out. And this becomes, and the preferred patterns that many people were using are forms that go back into those Islamic traditions of decorative design, but much degraded, as we see in contemporary linoleum or many contemporary expressions. And he's recuperated this and, in a sense, restored it by filling in the worn-out sections with gold thread, and embellishing this with even more sumptuous appearing materials, but they're glass beads or faux crystal components, which give it this very luxurious quality. Okay. And in addition, when I mentioned that one can talk about textile without actually using textile technologies or textile fibrous materials. An example of that would be Sasha Reichstein, whose work, or this particular work, looks at sweatshops of the kind of production in offshoring to low-wage economies in other parts of the world. And in this sweatshop in Sri Lanka, there are women making lederhosen, the German traditional garments, but obviously they're knockoffs, not the real things, to be sold to tourists in parts of Germany. And the one person who isn't wearing the uniform is the only male figure in this group. He's not at a sewing machine as they are, and it's unclear exactly what he's doing, but what's striking is the t-shirt he's wearing, which where you see the eagle and the logo that gives the work its title. And another example, this one by Frau Feiber, who's the avatar of Carol Francis Lung, who's set up a kind of standoff in a kind of John Henry-like way between handwork, craft, forms of making that, in this case, cause one to question how expressive, how sustaining handwork necessarily is in the language of craftivist discourse of the early 21st century, because she's knitting a white sock. And behind her is an automated machinery that's spitting out pairs of white socks. And in the time it takes her to knit this one particular sock, some 4 hours and 32 minutes, which is recorded live, the machine spits out 99 pairs. So we have a kind of lampooning of notions of creativity and expression that's generated with handwork. We have some references, I think, to piecework and cottage industry in earlier moments of textile production and the industrialization of textile. And I think this, yes, 2 more. Then a reference to dress and costume in the case of Jeffrey Gibson, whose work, as you may know, is representing the US in the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. He is part Choctaw and Cherokee, and there's a body of kind of bespoke costume, ritualistic performance costume, that he titled The Anthropophagic Effect, which speaks to a manifesto by Andrea del Andrade. No, that's not, I'm butchering the name.
Yeah.
Manuel Andrade, that's not it either.
No, it's, yeah.
Nice. Thank you. Sorry. And I'm sorry, I apologize for this. This manifesto argues that indigenous cultures, if they absorb the colonial culture, if they take it in, cannibalize it, can then repurpose it to constructive, creative effects. And so what he's doing is playing in different ways through helmets and kind of millinery and costumes like this one, which incorporate woven caning in the bodice part of the garment, powwow regalia in the jingles and some of the ribbons, and in the woven textile areas, there's a photographic imprint in the black and white sections of protests with protesters meeting police, heavily equipped police on the streets, and another more nurturing image under the caning here. And a work by Anne Hamilton that involves needle felting a single fleece from heritage sheep, which onto a coat, a secondhand coat, both of which she sourced in the area of a town in northern Portugal where she was making an exhibition. And this town had been a textile manufacturing city or hub that, like so many in Western Europe and North America, crashed, went belly up And the town is now very poor, and so you don't find secondhand coats, or people do not recycle their clothing. So it took her a long time to source those and then put them back into communion, or a kind of interdependent relationship with the sheep that were bred in the farming regions around the city. So these are examples that don't speak, I think, to the kinds of textiles that were part of second wave feminism, to stitching, quilting on the whole, to embroidery. They speak to weaving, to woven forms, to film and video, and they also, I think, in ways that perhaps are not so evident in these examples, though in the Gibson to some extent, they also look not to the 60s and 70s, as so much art of the later 20th century did, as a touchstone and point of generative point, but to the interwar years, and particularly the 20s, and to pioneering women artists who were part of the historical avant-gardes. So not to unknown artists, but to artists who, at that moment, were celebrated for their contributions, whether in the Bauhaus or Sonia Delaunay in Paris, Sophie Teuber-Arp in Zurich as part of Zurich Dada, and so forth. So this, again, for me, marks the kind of work that we've been seeing in this century that's really quite different in its thematics, in some of its choice of technologies, and in its reference points to the past, both pasts in Western modernism and beyond.
Thank you so much. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to parse myself. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you both about, and I think you both sort of touched upon it briefly or maybe implicitly in your conversations, but it's this idea kind of the center versus the margin. You know, we kind of playfully named our event Out of the Margin because, yes, of course, there has been a lot of institutionalized attention to textiles and fiber-based art. We can talk about the second part afterwards. But also, I wanted to kind of ask you what it also means. Like, is there power in coming out of the margins or from the margins? You know, Lynne, in your really wonderful exhibition, it seems like you use abstraction kind of almost as a Trojan horse to sort of bring textiles to the really center of the Western canon. Even though there are a lot of really wonderful kind of nuances throughout the show, I really noticed a kind of like a very intentional intention to kind of claim the center. Versus Julia, of course, you know, you named your book Fray. It seems for you, when you think about textiles and politics, there is a kind of value in the edge, right, and in the margins. I think for an exhibition, for example, like Threats to the South, similarly, we're kind of claiming the margins, or maybe even saying, you know, there are so many margins that also means that there can be a lot of different centers. And so I would really love to hear your thoughts on that. Sort of, what is the value of the margins? What is the value of the center? And why is it so important for conversations around textiles?
Oh, well, thank you for the question. It's really thought-provoking, and as you noted, the book that I wrote about textiles, the title, Fray, means many different things, and one of the conceits of the book is that textiles, in a way, you know, a textile can be prone to fraying, and fraying often happens at a border or an edge. And I make the claim through a series of case studies that, you know, textiles are often in the fray, in the muck of debate and disagreement around precisely where their politics lie. And some of the case studies that I chose, for example, the NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt, has always been a very unsettled object in terms of how people understood it on the one hand as far too radical, other activists thinking it's very regressive. I mean, and those things, they're not resolved. They remain in the fray, you know? And I think for myself, thinking about centers and margins, those things would always be plural for me, and they would always be really movable, flexible. I think there's a power to remaining in the margins. I think myself as like a queer feminist scholar, I really find there to be a tremendous strength in remaining in the shadows. You know, there's can be a lot of surveillance if you kind of come into the light, etc. I think it's a very exciting moment in terms of textiles, which have been seen as lower or lesser than, getting all this institutional claim. And of course, I want my heroes to make money, and I want my friends who make textiles to make a living, and I want the people that, you know, of course. I also think there is something to be said for the wiliness, you know, of a lot of these practices and how they have flown under the radar for so long, and how there could be, and that there are so many histories that are still being uncovered, you know, and there's students in this room who are doing really exciting projects that are way beyond thinking about just like lineages of named artists, way beyond that, thinking in so many other directions. And I just couldn't be more excited to actually have this model of center and margin kind of evaporate altogether.
I would make a multipartite answer. One of the driving claims of this exhibition is that there's been a form of abstraction since early modernism, which is not based in metaphysics like Mondrian and Malevich, which is not a form of a kind of reduction from representation, as in Cubism, but is based in textile. It's a materialist abstraction. It's rooted in the everyday in the world. In a way that neither of those languages are, and it's been there from the get-go. In that, you see it in the work of Sophie Teuber-Up and Sonia Delaunay from, you know, during the First World War. And you see it in Teuber-Up, for example, in the way that she takes a form of geometric abstraction, which is integral to the needlepoint, or it's integral to beading, and transmutes it straight into watercolors so it's a language that's continuing, and there's no hierarchical distinction for her between these different practices. Like she makes cross-stitch art that she frames and places on the wall. She places beside it watercolors in a form of geometric abstraction, which look much more familiar and might be related to Bauhaus or constructivism in Moscow, but it's all one for her. And that tradition, I think, has continued through the 20th century, somewhat intermittently, but that it informs a kind of practice in the 60s that finds in the grid as the central trope in abstraction, in Rosenkrauss's formulation, absolutely stultifying a cul-de-sac, and to kind of revitalize it and make meaning out of it turns to textile and decorative arts, as you see in Alan Shields or Valerie Jordan and so forth. And I would say again, in another form of abstraction in the late 90s and into the present has come out of textile in relation to the Jacquard loom, obviously the computer, and to the hardware and technology of that in works that take the computer chip as models or QR codes. So again and again, you have these moments in which abstraction, as it continues, not necessarily as the preeminent language of modernism anymore, but it does continue, and it's being revitalized over and over by textile. And in that sense, yes, I'm interested in the center. I mean, I really want that to be kind of placed back into the histories in a way, or placed into the histories that in ways it hasn't been. But on the other hand, there's work that I am deeply invested in, like Rosemary Trockel, and her use of, particularly in relation to dress and attire and fashion. She's played with it in many ways since the mid-80s when her work first matured. And in these garments and later pictures of garments and references to dress, it's all about subcultures and disaffection with normativity with the center and identifications with resistance, with other sets of values. And I think you see it too in Andrea Zattel, differently in Paulina Orlovska. So there are moments when, yes, the edges and margins are places, preferred places, places of strength to work from. So I would want to have it both ways.
But you're revising the center. I mean, it's an intervention into the discourse of what has been central, which is abstract.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think to follow up with that and to touch upon your very interesting notes about sort of textiles versus art, I did want to talk about this sort of idea or very tenuous notion of art, and particularly, of course, in relation to craft when it comes to textiles. I think, as you say, both categories are problematic, particularly through the kind of Western lens. And an exhibition like the Arts of the South kind of very easily say, this is a Western notion, a Western distinction, we're not going to pay attention to that. But I should note that we do sort of very intentionally use the word art because for these artists, craft is art, for example. But I wanted to ask you both, because I think in both of your projects, you're sort of very, I think, subtly and also very intentionally sort of looking at these distinctions, which are very Western, and you both recognize that, and you sort of push back against them in ways that I find really fascinating. For example, then one of the sort of comparisons or placements that you have in the show is sort of Sheila Hicks and Eva Hesse, two women that have been working with fiber textiles, one seen as a very conceptual artist, and the other one is seen as more craft-based, and therefore gets shown in institutions that reflect that. And I think, Julia, you mentioned this a little bit when you talked about your show, Feminist Histories, or Women's Histories. But also, in Frey, you sort of positioned Cecilia Vicuña's work next to the Arpilleras, which is fascinating. So I would love to hear you both talk a little bit more about that, how intentional that is, how important is sort of circulation for that sort of weird distinction between art and craft. Why are both terms kind of problematic and lacking? Big question, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Maybe you start.
Okay. I think craft can mean different things, and it's a slippery term, and it's, but in relation specifically to this juxtaposition of Hesse and Sheila Hicks, it's in a gallery that looks at post-war textile and abstract art together, mostly in the Americas and mostly in North America. And the way in which the growth of the studio crafts movement, as it was called, was fueled by textile artists and many others working with jewelry or working with ceramics, but who saw themselves, and they were, professionals of a high order, trained. They were very cognizant of their histories, and they showed in orbits in which those art forms were prioritized. Both Sheila Hicks and Eva Hesse were students of Joseph Albers in the late 50s. I think they didn't quite overlap, but they both began with this gestural abstraction. By the mid-60s, they're working in ways that briefly overlap. Eva Hesse is downtown on the cutting edge of vanguard practices. Sheila Hicks is coming in and out of the city. And they're working with chords and gravity and linear forms very similarly, but of course they didn't cross paths. Those two worlds were utterly set apart. That's not the case at other moments. But you can make another comparison exactly at that time between Agnes Martin and Lenore Tawney, who did know each other. They live in the same building.
Well, they were lovers, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
And their work is reflecting this exchange
Yeah, right.
and really close interdependence. But the circulation of the work is not, and that interdependence is never talked about.
Yeah.
Like it's as if they're just on two different planets. So in that sense, this moment of craft and the segregation and the very strong categorization and policing of categories is one of the things I was very interested in.
Well, I think what you just said is so important about, I mean, for myself, I have a lot of, I mean, sometimes I say I'm ambivalent about the words art and craft. I'm agnostic about the words art. You know, I have a lot of different words to express how much they don't matter to me necessarily, and how I want to strive always for much more kind of precision and specificity. But what Lynne just said, which is just so crucial, is that we may think, like, who cares, art, craft, we're kind of over it, you know, because it's 2024, but they have had really strong material repercussions if something is categorized, if something is slotted into one world or the other, as if they're on separate planets, as you said, and valuations, radically discrepant valuations. So, I mean, I think it is what I try to exhort to my students or in my own scholarship or in projects that I do, is that, yeah, to be attentive to like local words and historical words, like how did the makers identify, you know, where did the things circulate in their lifetime or after? I mean, and often, you know, the categories slip and slide, you know, something that was considered craft to somebody that then gets reclassified. I mean, it has huge repercussions for how those things get taught, how those things get collected, how those things get preserved or not, or forgotten, et cetera. And so, you know, it's really painful, actually, to have made a show like Women's Histories and see exquisite, fine embroidery, you know, where we know nothing about the person who made that, as opposed to a painting made in the same time where we have really extensive biographies, you know? So yeah, I don't personally care to police those things at all. In fact, I'm all for getting rid of the categories, but we have to be really mindful of how much they have sedimented certain things in stone. Yeah.
Thank you both. How are we doing on time, Olivia? Do we have time for one more question and then Q&A? Okay, just making sure. So thank you. I also wanted to really quick, I mean, I have so many questions, but I'll filter. I wanted to speak a little bit about this importance of material and the importance of kind of structure and technique that you both kind of alluded to. Lynne, I think, you know, I've seen talks where you talk about woven histories, and you mentioned that you kind of had to filter what sort of type of textiles you would focus on, and you mentioned that you settled on structural textiles. And I wanted to maybe ask you a little bit more about that, and of course in relation to abstraction. I know there's an importance of the grid here, but why is it so important to sort of like focus on the structure of the textile when thinking about these types of projects? And then I have an additional question for you, Julie.
Thank you. It's a good question. Partly it's logistics. Like, there's a huge history of textiles. There's textiles of so many different kinds and forms. Obviously, making a show, one can't address it all. And it took me the longest time to figure out how to find a path. And as I said, I was beginning in the present, and many of the works like Gigshan Adams and Diedrich Bracken's were woven. And I thought, this is really interesting. And why weaving, and why, what can it do? And of course, if you look back to the 20s, the most theorized ideas about textile making are coming out of the Bauhaus. And there's a very strong argument for structural textiles. In the actual weave is the design. It's not applied. It's not printed, it's not embroidered, it's there. And that really drives Annie Albers and Günter Stötzel and others, and it's very powerful, I think. Even the Russians, Popova and Stepanova, may have got there had they ever entered a factory. I mean, they were stuck in their studios because they were not given access, but they were also involved with dress and making ready-to-wear, affordable clothing for the modern worker, both as uniform and as leisure wear. But in terms of the productivity of ideas around textile making and design, that for me was, that brought the 21st century examples, many of the ones I was interested in, together with beginning of the 20th century, and of course offered a very useful path for thinking with abstraction and seeing in the beginnings of the 40s and 50s parallels that were formalist and materialist and later became thematic or pre-loom parallels as basketry enters into it, but that's a different story.
I also had a question about that, but just to be brief and to kind of follow up, Julia, I have to say that, I mean, a lot of things about Frey inspired this exhibition, I have to say. But one of them was your sort of, when you talk about the work of Cecilia Vicuña, you sort of, you argue for what you call an expanded field of fiber-based practice, meaning, you know, in relation to Cecilia Vicuña, sort of what you call pre-constructed fibers, but you also speak about how we might think about fibers and textiles as a way that sort of steps away from the kind of like common conceptions that surround particularly fiber art, et cetera. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. How can we understand an expanded idea of fiber-based practice, and how is construction still important in that sense?
Right. I'll try to be very brief. It's such a huge, expansive question, so to expand on expansion. It's difficult to even formulate a beginning, but I guess I'll just point to this piece here, which, you know, it's a performance. It's photo documentation of a performance. It lives in many different iterations. It's also the poster. It's, you know, in collaboration with CADA, which is a Chilean collective, but it was performed in Bogota. It's a dense, rich piece that points in many different directions, also about a kind of corporate crime around poisoned milk. I mean, there's a lot of things going on here. But this red thread, which is kind of at the center of everything, and her skirt also, I think the ruffle of the skirt is also a very important part of this action, you know, as Lynne was saying, that you can engage in textiles without making a textile, you know? So here she's just tying a red piece of yarn around a glass of actually glue, was it milk, to create this spill. And this is a textile piece, even though it's not, you know, we're not looking literally at fiber here. We're looking at photo documentation of a performance. So I think that's part of what I was meant by this expanded field, is that there is a kind of promiscuity around medium, you know? And actually for the cover of Frey, the picture I most wanted was just literally kind of like a tangle of yarn in the gutter. It's such a great piece by Cecilia. And my editor was like, it's so gritty and anthropological. It's just, you know, and doesn't speak to like art or, you know, it's just literally like, looks like it's just a wad of trash in the gutter. And I was like, that's exactly why I love it. That's exactly why it is the most perfect cover, you know, and they just said no, you know. So I think part of it too was Cecilia's absolute just refusal to always traffic in the expectations about what textile art or fiber-based art should look like, you know? She wants to kind of be in the gritty and the anthropological, you know? And she doesn't want to like finish a thing. It's always about like process and unmaking and, you know, like, yeah, singing out and kind of like the threads unraveling.
Thank you. Should we do maybe one or two questions from the audience? Olivia, you're the boss. Let us know how many. Anybody has a question? Yes?
So thank you so much for this. In the spirit of expanding your notions of textile, I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about labor in relation to textiles, particularly when we have female weavers involved in textile making because of the relationship with labor in the domestic space. So weaving begins as fixing clothing and weaving, braiding our hair, all of these sort of situations that aren't part necessarily of the formal economic model, but are rooted in labor.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah,
I would love to hear Anna talk about that from the perspective of this show, because it's such an important theme, such an important theme.
Sure, thank you so much. I also had it as a question, so thanks. And I should note that, yes, I mean, I think when talking about textiles, the idea of labor is key. For this particular show, I will say that because the Arts of the South really I was very interested in having a sort of decolonial approach to every aspect of it. I was really interested in the idea of sort of domesticity and kind of reclaiming domesticity as labor. I think when we talk a lot about sort of textiles and labor, we tend to talk about sort of industrialization of textiles. But in this show, as you can kind of very easily notice, a lot of the artists are referencing domestic labor that has been taught by them, for example, by their mothers. And so I was inspired by a work actually by Annette Weiner, who's an anthropologist, called Inalienable Possessions, which sort of speaks to the way in which textiles relationship in certain communities, she's working, in the Oceanic Islands, in certain communities, women's sort of very close relationship with textiles and their relationship with reproductions is really what gives them value. So in a show like this, I really wanted to sort of like reclaim that domesticity through labor and sort of understanding that the domestic doesn't necessarily have to be a place of oppression, but instead a place of power, but also maybe even transgression. And therefore, a lot of these artists are sort of like understanding domestic labor as something that gives them power as sort of, Latin Americans. But I know, for example, in your show, Lynne, there's a really interesting sort of dynamic between the industrial and the domestic, and a lot of the artists are kind of like trying to step away from the domestic and sort of like closer to the idea of the industrial. Too, you may perhaps, skewer associations with craft, and so I would love also to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
I thank you. I think it's again a case of situating the question and how to interpret it. And certainly in the 20s, there's this belief in technology, in a technologically improved future, social change through the bounties of technology, utopian social visions based in growth in textile, growth in technology, and textile is very much part of that. So in that moment, there's it's designing for industry, which is critical to making this social change, to creating the tools for social change, for better lives materially, and in terms of the significations of what those values are. And there's very little questioning of that. And in the National Gallery, as it happened, for a variety of reasons, Frau Fiber was put into that. And that really, I think, served to point up how little the question of the hand and hand making and the harms and the costs of technology was ever considered in those years. And then there's another moment much later with Zoe Leonard's work where I think that's coming to the fore as she plays with an essay of Annie Albers and substitutes photographs of textiles that are found in her apartment, everyday textiles, for the very refined and very beautiful textiles that Albers was designing for interiors. And again, at a time when American textile industry led the world and was known for innovation and invention and quality, right at the moment where that was ending. And Albers too was not asking where is the text, where do these materials come from? And that would have been easy to find out. It's not now. The supply chains are so concealed and they're so protected against investigation and questioning of the kinds of practices and exploitation that goes on.
I think maybe we can leave it at that.
Yeah.
Or, yes.
We can always continue the conversation
Yes.
over the reception.
But thank you both so much.
Thank
This
you.
was
All right.
lovely.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for that.